everywhere you've had a Marxist revolution, nowhere have you really had the alternative system be worker cooperatives. It's always been state ownership. So the idea that the socialist revolution was to turn on the means of production or the production to the workers is complete rubbish. Where has there ever been a Marxist revolution that has ended up in a democratic system? They've all ended up as one-party systems, even Yugoslavia. So the whole idea that this is some sort of economic democracy and somehow it just went wrong with Lenin and Stalin is nonsense. It's straight out of Marx. The dictatorship of the proletariat. And the representative proletariat, the organized state, is the state.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. The nature of the contract between labor and capital has a powerful effect on the experience of work, but how closely do most of us really examine the nature of those contracts? We've heard the endless debates about Marxism versus capitalism, but that's a false dichotomy. Compelling visions for economic democracy and employee-owned cooperatives do exist today. David Ellerman is a distinguished economist, philosopher, and author with a career focused on the crossroads of economics, philosophy, and organizational theory. He's held prominent roles such as economic advisor at the World Bank, where he played a key role in shaping development policy and institutional reforms. Before that, David was a visiting scholar at the University of California, Riverside, and lectured at Boston University. In this episode, David and I discuss the historical context of labor contracts and alienation, differences between alienable and inalienable rights, and the link between performance management systems and American slavery. We also delve into the flawed basis of Marxist and traditional economic theories, real-world examples of democratic firms and worker cooperatives, the psychological cost of layoffs in an organization, and other topics. All right, if you enjoyed David's insights today, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Without further ado, enjoy my conversation with David Ellerman. David Ellerman, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you.
So I want to tell you how we arrived at this conversation, which is that I had somebody on the show named Melissa Swift, and she mentioned a paper, which was The Messy Link Between Slave Owners and Modern Management, that was written by Caitlin Rosenthal. And it talked about how performance management was something that came out of American slavery. And so I set out to understand the norms of slavery. And in another show, I spoke with Cambridge classicist Jerry Toner about the norms of Roman slavery. And that led me to question the nature of contracts, employment contracts, because Romans had a different understanding of the, I'm going to say, contract between slave owner and slave than the Greeks did. And so as I started down this path of wanting to understand more about modern labor contracts, I ran across your work, which is fascinating. And it strikes so deeply at so many misconceptions and misunderstandings that I had that I really wanted to talk to you. And so thank you for coming on the show. You are in favor of something called economic democracy. What are we today? What is the opposite of that? What is it today?
Well, if you approach the sort of three different avenues of approach to the whole question of the democratic firm, but if you go back into, you mentioned Roman time, and rather than talk about Roman slavery, talk about the Roman political basis. There was something called the lex regia, the law of the prince or the ruler. And the idea was that the people have alienated their right to govern themselves to the prince or to the ruler. And this was idea which is called a pact of subjection, in Latin, pactum subjectionis. It's the contract by which, a social contract, essentially mythological, but that's not the point. The point is it's a reconstruction of sort of rational basis for the order is that people have given up the right to govern themselves, transferred that, alienated that to the monarch, to the sovereign, to the king, whatever it is. This carries through the Middle Ages, almost all the caught on. Of course, the rulers would say, well, we're ruling by divine right and all that. They would throw whatever idea to legitimate their rule against the wall to see what sticks. But the most modern type of legitimation was to say that there's a social contract of alienation. So the real rise of democratic theory wasn't saying that government should be based on the consent of the governed, because that's been the theory ever since Roman time. The government's based on the consent of the governed, but it's consent to alienate your rights rather than just to delegate them to your representatives or delegates in the government. So if it's a delegation contract, then of course you're still the principal. You're still the ones that the rulers rule in the name of the people. And so that's the real history of democratic thought, is not the transition from status to contract, but the status transition from contract of alienation to contract of delegation. And then you say, okay, well, what is the employment contract? Well, employment contract is a contract of alienation. The employer is not the delegate, not the representative of the employees. No one ever thought that. So it's just reproducing, recapitulating, as it were, the history of political thought in the firm by starting with a contract of alienation. In a democratic firm, it's where the people that work in the firm are the members, are the citizens, and the contractual basis of the firm is a contract of delegation. So the people that manage in the name of those who are managed, and their power is delegated to them, not alienated to them, and so on. So you have a clear transition from the history of political thought, democratic thought for the government, to the government of the firm. And what we have today is the pactum subjectionis of the firm. You give up your rights to govern yourself within the scope of the government contract, for 8 or whatever hours a day it is, and so forth. And the employer is not by any stretch of the imagination the delegate or the representative of the employees. It's almost the other way around, that the employees are the agents and the employer is the principal in a master-servant relationship.
That history speaks very much about the difference between alienable rights and inalienable rights. And it leads to the idea that there are some rights that are inalienable. And one of those is, according to democratic theory, you cannot choose to be subjugated. But I don't understand what makes a right inalienable. Does that descend from natural law, or is it just something we agree to?
It's an entirely factual question. If people were like robots that you could flip a switch and they would become robots, then the labor contract would be perfectly ordinary contract. You're alienating your responsible agency, your personhood, in flipping the switch, and they're not governing a person in a non-democratic way. They're just giving instructions to a robot. But people can't do that. And when a person goes into a employment contract, they remain a person. They remain de facto responsible for their actions. They remain a decision maker. The way to see this, which is really clear, is to look at the hired criminal. So we're not talking about legal liability, we're talking about factual liability. And it's quite clear in the law that when the hired worker commits a crime, even at the behest of the employer, just like the slave, and the slave committed a crime at all or at the behest of the master, they suddenly became responsible persons. So factually, that responsibility is the same if the contract is legal. Obviously, a contract to commit a crime is not legal, but the factual responsibility is the same. So you're just as factually responsible for your actions if the employer tells you to rob a bank or tells you to make a widget. And yet the contract system we have says, oh no, if the contract to commit a crime is not a valid contract, but the contract to alienate your legal responsibility for your work, we're going to count that as valid. Just the way the slave was legally a non-person, an instrument, talking instrument, unless they committed crimes. Then they suddenly, the factual status of the slave as a person came to the forefront, and they were treated as persons when they committed crimes. It's the same thing. And so people cannot understand that, the difference between factual and legal responsibility, which is, that's what's decided in a court of law by the jury. The jury doesn't decide questions of law. The jury decides questions of fact. If the person is found factually guilty, then the law says, okay, you're legally guilty, and so forth. So the hired criminal example sort of brings that thing to the forefront. What is inalienable is your factual responsibility. We are not part-time computers or robots. We're normal people at the workplace, just as we are when we're not at the workplace. We're just as responsible, just as much a decision maker. When you're in a situation where you're producing something, you're responsible for the results of your actions, positive and negative. So that's the property argument. I mean, there's a democratic argument, and then there's a property argument that you are the ones who, in the economic terms, you got to use up the inputs and produce the outputs. Remember your economics courses in the past. And the people who work in the firm do that. But factually, it's like as if the employer was using everybody as just an instrument. The employer bears all the liabilities and owns all the product. And the people that are rented themselves just get the rental, the wage. Your question was, what's the basis for the inalienability? And I pointed out, the basis is factual. You did not become a non-person by signing an employment contract. You did not become a talking instrument within the scope of the employment. You remain a responsible person, as everybody recognizes when you commit a crime, which changes the legal status of the contract, but doesn't change the factual status. You remain a person. So what is inalienable is personhood, or, responsibility for your actions or decision making, whatever you want to call the thing that separates persons from things. That's inalienable factually. But the law, as under slavery and as under rental systems, says, well, if you agree to alienate it, well, that's a contract, and we're going to enforce the contract.
So slavery was coercive. It was actually not always coercive, actually. It's one of the things Jerry Toner pointed out.
Yeah, there were a few cases, well publicized to be sure, where the slaves wanted to remain that because they had no other opportunity. But the employment relationship is surely voluntary by any standard means. But the point is, you can't voluntarily become a robot. You voluntarily agree to this thing to take orders, but you remain a person, factually. So my argument is, it has nothing to do with the voluntary. A lot of people have the argument, oh, well, it's wage slavery and people are coerced and they have no alternative. No, that's not the point. A lot of contracts we would rather not make. When we buy something, we'd like to buy it for half the price. And there are all sorts of difficult decisions. And when going to work, when you have no other alternative, that's a difficult decision, but it's certainly not involuntary by any normal notion of voluntariness. And a lot of people on the left just sort of like to skip the inalienability argument and just say, well, by my standards, it's involuntary. They sort of escalate their notions of involuntary, and that's just superficial thinking. It's voluntary by any normal standard in the law, but the contract alienates that which is factually inalienable.
And when we ended the practice of slavery, a part of what we said was, you cannot sell yourself. You cannot voluntarily go into slavery. That is impossible. It is inalienable.
Well, that was actually a separate law. It was the Constitutional Amendment, but then there was a law passed, I think the next year, called the Act Against Voluntary Peonage. And that was intended to forbid the natural substitution. Okay, you're now a free person, but you're using my land, you're using my instruments, using my corn. So people just recreated the slave relationship, treating the slave as if they were an independent farmer. And that's called peonage. You owe your soul to the company store, and the old song. And that law was passed the same year. It was never enforced, of course. The whole South set up a whole system of peonage until modern times. And it still exists, of course, across the world. So it's true that abolition abolished both involuntary slavery and voluntary slavery.
And so the argument that people are going into employment contracts today voluntarily, that they are not coerced, is sometimes an argument that says this is fundamentally different. But you would say it is that voluntariness is not the measure that we should be using.
As I say, we make a lot of decisions that we would rather not make. And, when a person submits himself to an employment relationship, rather than being, an independent business person or so forth, they would love to be usually independent and running their own business or something like that. So it's a difficult decision, but it's certainly, involuntary doesn't mean decisions are all easy. There's a lot of hard decisions people have to make. And the employment relationship is a voluntary by any judicial standard. And that's just part of the superficial thinking on the left. Well, my standards of voluntariness are higher, and by my standards, this is involuntary. That's not a serious argument.
What did Marx get wrong?
Where to start? What did he get right?
And I'll tell you, there's a really interesting thing, though, when you speak, and I've listened to a lot of your talks, is that you refer to the left independent of Marx, as if the left is a thing independent of Marx. For me, Marx has always been the definition of the left. When you talk about what the left is, independent of Marx, I don't even know what you're talking about. So I'm not sure where to start, but I guess let's start with Marx, and then I'll get to this question. Let's start with the left. What is the left independent of Marx? And then let's talk about Marx.
A little bit of history. If you go back to John Stuart Mill, who writing alongside Marx in the middle of the 19th century, never really heard of Marx. And he made a famous saying that if mankind is going to continue to improve, it will end up in the state of people democratically electing their leaders and being the members of the firm and so forth. So he says all that in 1848. Now, that's a radical statement today. So what happened between 1848 and almost, century and 3/4 since then? Well, what happened is Marx and Lenin and the Russian Revolution, which the system defined as the alternative. The system's not John Stuart Mill. They say, no, the alternative system is Marx. And of course, the left bought into that. And some of the conceptual mistakes made by Marx are wonderful for the apologist for the system. For example, Marx correctly, I think, analyzed the feudal system as saying that whoever owned the land was the lord of the land. They governed the people that lived on the land. They appropriated the fruits of their labor. So what we today call the landlord was the lord of the land because there was no market in land. So Marx says, I quote this many times, he said, we have the same system, but you have to substitute capital for land. So whoever owns the means of production is the one that governs the people in production because of that, and they own the product of production because of that. And that's simply wrong. The capital is rentable, and you can have a firm where the land is rented, the building is rented, the space is rented, the machinery is rented, people are rented. And so the owner of the means of production is not the firm. It's not the one that's governing labor. It's not the one that's owning the product. And in fact, there's a wonderful historical example of this. If you go back to the early 50s, the company Studebaker-Packard, the merging of Studebaker and Packard, had their auto bodies produced by a separate company called Briggs Manufacturing in Detroit, in particular by the plant in Detroit on Connor Avenue. And then old man Briggs died, and his family had no succession plan. So they sold all the plants that Briggs Manufacturing to Chrysler. So here you had the bodies being produced for Studebaker-Packard in a plant where the entire plant was owned by Chrysler, and Chrysler leased the plant to them, leased the plant to Studebaker-Packard. So here you have a case where the whole means of production, the entire factory, owned by Chrysler, but the management control over the workers in that factory, the appropriation of the product of that factory, the paying of the liabilities, the cost for that factory, all was in the hands of Studebaker. Studebaker didn't own the means of production. So obviously Marx was wrong in saying that legally the key thing is who owns the means of production, because capital is rentable. Factories are leasable, not medieval land. There was no land market in medieval times. So those things were collapsed together in what was called dominion. But in modern times, it's legally not who owns the means of production, but who has made the contracts in such a way that they rent what they don't own, what they need but don't own. They can rent it. They can rent factories. They can rent land, buildings, all the other inputs. They can rent people. So the real basis for capitalism is not that capital cannot be rented, but that people are rented. And so that's why I keep saying it's really the human rental system. So Marx got it completely wrong as to what was the whole basis for the system. Now, what do you think is the reaction to the apologist for the system? Marx handed them the best apology they could possibly have by giving him the analysis that's based on private ownership of the means of production. So they can all present themselves as the defenders of private property, saying the system's it's not based on renting people, it's based on private property, and we are the protectors of private property, blah, blah, blah. Yet, if you analyze the system of private property, how do you acquire private property? Well, you acquire it by exchange, with somebody acquired it before, but eventually you have to get to people owning the fruits of their labor. That's the real legitimate base. No other basis for the creation of new property or assignment of liabilities for used up property, because it's positive and negative, is the fruits of people's labor, the positive and negative fruits of labor. So the very system based on violating the basis of private property is handed to them by Marxism, as you are the defenders of private property. So I don't know if you read the paper, but I have a whole paper called Marxism as a Capitalist Tool.
Yeah.
Marx handed the whole thing to them. And in one of my recent books, I have a quasi joke where I say that the system should subsidize Marxist economists to keep the idea that the alternative is Marxism, not economic democracy, but Marxism, and that the only reason the CIA isn't subsidizing Marxist economists is that the CIA is not that bright.
And I want to reiterate the argument a little bit to make sure I understand it. Marx said, look, the owners of capital are essentially renting the people, and that's because capital is in control.
It's, of course, true that the owners of capital have the bargaining power, but that labor can legally hire capital just as capital can legally rent people. So the basis of the normal system of production, legal basis, we're talking the law here, is the employment contract. And Studebaker had the control of the workers. Studebaker appropriated the product of the workers, and Studebaker did not own the means of production. And it was so this unusual circumstance, true. But if you're just saying all Marx was saying was that the capitalist has the bargaining power, well, every high school kid knows that. That doesn't require any theory. The question was, what's the legal system? What is the legal basis for the appropriation of the product, the control of workers? And that is the human rental system. And that's why I call it neo-abolitionism, because we've already abolished the system to own workers, and voluntarily or involuntarily. And what we have in its place is the system of renting people, and voluntarily. So it's a neo form of abolitionism.
I want to go back to this clarification of the Marx bit, which is what Marx argued for was, look, as long as there is, I'm going to say capital is owned by private people are going to essentially enslave the workforce. So the solution there was to go after private ownership, make it something that's owned by the state. But I think that one of the things you've said is that just changes who's renting the workforce at that point. It hasn't really fundamentally changed the idea.
That's state capitalism, yeah.
State capitalism, yeah.
The state has become the employer rather than private parties. And that cements the idea that everywhere you've had a Marxist revolution, nowhere have you really had the alternative system be worker cooperatives or something like, the Mondragon cooperatives. It's always been state ownership. Even in, say, Cuba, for 50 years or so, private worker cooperatives were not even allowed. So the idea that the socialist revolution was to turn on the means of production or the production to the workers is complete rubbish. And the closest, of course, came was Yugoslavia, which broke away from the usual notion of socialism, the Marxist notion, but it was still controlled by a single party, the Marxist Party. And so that ended up being a fatal limitation on what they could do. But I was amused one time. I was having a drinking spell with a Yugoslav economist, and I said, you're trying to do this thing called self-management, and where is all this self-management in Marx? And he paused and had another drink, and eventually said, we have to live in a state, Yugoslavia, controlled by a Marxist party. But if you really want to get to the origin of this idea of workers running production, not state ownership, it's more Proudhon than Marx. And I don't know if you know the history there, but Proudhon was a great rival of Marx, the French anarcho-syndicalist, or what do you want to call him. But there were people at the time of Marx that had very good theories, and Marx was a very dominant intellectual and incredible writer and so forth. So they were more or less bypassed in the course of intellectual history. But if you go back, you'll see there were people at the time that had very good ideas and were not as coherent, or as intellectually Germanic as Marx, who was an incredible theoretician. One of the debates I have with some of my other friends is, what is Marx's biggest blunder? So I consider his biggest blunder this idea that the base of the system is private ownership means production. But one of my good friends, Bo Rothstein, says, no, the biggest blunder is Marx's idea that the working class was going to create the new system. And he says, this has never happened anywhere. It's always been the intellectual class that has these ideas and so forth. And then the other very simple thing is, where has there ever been a Marxist revolution that has ended up in a democratic system? They've all ended up as one-party systems, even Yugoslavia. So the whole idea that this is some sort of economic democracy and somehow it just went wrong with Lenin and Stalin is nonsense. It's straight out of Marx. The dictatorship of the proletariat, and the representative proletariat, the organized state, is the state.
I want to get on to examples of alternatives. What are some examples, living examples of alternatives to rental of people?
Well, the organizational form is essentially where people that work in the firm are the members of the firm. There's several ways to approach that. If you approach that as a worker cooperative, then that's pretty clear that the membership rights in a cooperative are assigned to whoever has patronage. So if it's a worker cooperative, patronage means people that work in the cooperative. So that's basically the idea. But when you assign the membership rights according to patronage, to fulfilling some role, then the rights cannot be sold. It's like the rights to citizenship. You have to qualify for those rights. You vote in a city because you reside in the city, so you can't sell that right to the Saudi wealth fund who wants to buy New York or something. But if you take that qualifying role to zero, then the membership rights become free-floating property rights, which can be bought and sold or inherited. And that's where the conventional corporation comes in. They're not cooperative corporations. They're ordinary corporations where there's no role that the owners of shares have to play. They just have to buy it as a property right. So they've squeezed out that notion of corporations should be people who've associated together to do something. If you go back to the Middle Ages, to the guilds, that was the idea of a corporation, or the universities in those days. So if you start with that idea of a corporation, then it's a question of the employees being the ones who are the shareholders. So you have to work within that legal structure. And that can happen too. I mean, that's what we're doing here in Slovenia, is we're using that legal structure, but we're saying, first of all, the shares are all owned by a separate legal vehicle, which is a worker cooperative. But the worker cooperative is not the operating entity, because it has to build up owning shares in the underlying company. But how do you be a member of that cooperative? Only if you're an employee of the underlying company. And then when it gets to be 100% ownership in the cooperative, then you can collapse the two firms together. And then you have a genuine worker cooperative. So different ways to approach it if you're talking legal access. But in the world today, the mecca for worker cooperatives is the Mondragon group in Spain. This is in the Basque Country, northern Spain. It was started after World War II, a Catholic priest. The economy was devastated, and he started these firms, which were cooperatives, and very, very intelligently structured them and so forth. And they've grown now to be a major factor in the Spanish economy. And they're the best sort of worldwide example. Mondragon is the name. Just you can Google it on the internet. They have all sorts of websites and videos and this and that. So that's sort of the ideal. But the practical question is, how do you get from here to there? And so that's what we're doing. We're doing something where you have, as it were, a Mondragon cooperative is the separate special purpose vehicle holding shares in the name of the workers, and the workers have accounts in how many shares they have. And it can build up, start at 10% and then go 20% and so forth. So that's applying the idea pioneered in America called the ESOP, the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, the various types of employee ownership. You said you grew up in San Diego, where the SAIC company, Science Applications, that's not an ESOP. That was an internal market where you had employees own the shares So it tried to simulate a stock market. But the ESOP is a much better idea because it has a separate legal entity. In the case of America, it's a trust, special type of pension trust. Normally, pension trust, private pension trust, cannot reinvest in the underlying employer's securities. They can only do maybe 10%. So the ESOP, Employee Stock Ownership Plan, is a carve out from normal pension law in the ERISA Act, the Employment Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, that says if you're a ESOP, you can invest 100% in employer securities. And the members of this trust, the beneficiaries in this case, it's not a cooperative, it's a trust that has beneficiaries, are all the employees in the company. So that's become a big deal now in America. 10% of the private workforce in America work in ESOPs. For example, when I lived in Riverside, there was a big grocery firm, Winco. It was called Winco, is a 100% employee-owned firm. There's also a chain of appliance stores, Howard's Appliances, which was in Riverside, maybe down your way. Those are all 100% employee-owned firms. And when an employee retires, the shares are bought back. So it remains employee-owned. It remains anchored in the local community, doesn't get bought by somebody else or by a competitor, and so forth. So it's really a different type of corporation. And it embodies the best one can within the existing legal structure, this idea that the people who are the members, or in this case, quote unquote owners, are the people that work in the firm. And that's the idea of a democratic firm.
You mentioned SAIC, the Science Applications International Corporation. John Beister, who founded it, lived several doors down from me. And it's like one of those things where I wish I had gone around talking to all the really interesting people who lived in my neighborhood, and he was one of them. I used to skateboard to school with his son. And not only was he doing something, first of all, you think of cooperatives and you think they're all making granola. This was a defense company. It spun out of General Atomic, I think. I think that's where Beister came from. And it was working for the government, and teams within it, I can't remember exactly how it worked, but teams within it would have responsibility for things that they were working on. And I don't completely understand. I need to study that.
I'm not criticizing him because this was all before ESOPs. So he had to sort of invent his own version. But his fortune, of course, went to his daughter, Marianne, and she is the CEO of the Beister Foundation. And they've set up an ESOP center now in the Ready Business School at UCSD, a management school on ESOPs. So ESOPs are like the successor to that idea that has more legal grounding and incredible track record. There's, I don't know, like 6,500 ESOPs in America now. But the best statistic is really 10% of the private workforce work in companies where they are shareholders in their company through an ESOP.
There's this one little sort of mathematical thing that I don't understand at the center of this. And by the way, a lot of your works, they get to a point where they get into math, and which is really interesting. But there's this thing of the directionality of contract. If I enter into a contract with you, it's binding in both directions. What I don't quite understand is when the directionality makes me an owner and you not the owner. I know a part of it has to do with the idea of who gets the residual profit. If there's residual money in a company that is employee-owned, the residual money goes to the employees. But there's more than that. There's some level of control that the employees have over the organization that they would not otherwise have. Is there more? Is that the two big things that make the direction of ownership?
In a non-cooperative conventional corporation, the members, because there's no role of patronage, the members can be anybody. So we don't talk about members, we talk about owners. And they're the shareholders, the common shareholders. And they delegate the contract between them and the management is a contract of delegation. So they delegate the managerial powers to the managers. And they, in theory, are the ones that are ultimately get the residual. In other words, the revenue minus the expenses, as if they were doing this themselves. But of course, they're typically absentee. And so the fiction has become blatant. But a lot of the economic theory acts as if there was one owner and he was the founder and the manager and everything else. But that's not the legal form. The legal form is it's the shareholders. They could be scattered over Helleback. Nobody has any idea who they are, even each other. But yes, they delegate the management rights to the management team, and they are the ones that own the residual. Management is hired typically, but we also have the problem of so-called separation of ownership and control in large firms where management has the control but not the ownership because of all the difficulties of shareholders actually having control over managers.
I have a sub-question about the employment contract. It's already in a standard corporation or a standard firm, a rental contract, but I noticed that it also comes with the elimination of a number of other rights. And I don't know if they're inalienable or not, but one of them is the right to free speech. One of them is the right to the ownership of your own product, the product that you create. And another one is the right to say where you are going to physically place your body, which is to say that there's control over your physical self about where you can sit. And those are three I can think of, and I don't know how many others are given up. Is that part and parcel of the problem with rentals, or is that a separate problem?
Well, when you give up the control of your use of your actions, your labor, within the scope of the employment contract, there's always the question of what's in the scope and what isn't. And can the employer tell you how to dress? Can the employer tell you what social media you use? Can the employer control your language? There's all these questions, and that's all just part of the constantly contested right of, well, you control my labor, but you can't tell me how to dress, or you can't tell me what I do after hours, or who I associate with. And the employer will say, well, yes, I can. And that's normal legal ambiguity in a contract. So that's not part of the nub of the matter. I mean, people get upset about that. And some of the literature the most superficial possible literature on the left is this idea of, can I take a pee break whenever I want? It depends entirely on the work situation, if it's assembly line or not, and so forth. But those are all subsidiary, detailed questions. And even in a democratic situation, people can't shout fire in a crowded theater and so forth. And there's limitations on speech. And so those are all sort of normal questions, and not the thing that defines what is wrong with the human rental contract. And by the way, I don't know if you followed the evolution of the term, but the name of the relationship is master-servant relationship historically. And there's even some law books like in Britain where it's still called master-servant relationship. So in the middle of the 19th century, if you look at John Stuart Mill, for example, or even Marx, they didn't know what to call the employees because those words weren't there yet. In English, the word employee was brought over from the French. I remember I looked at a Webster dictionary from 1895 or something, and it said that the word employee is an adaptation from the French and is not used by good writers. But now everybody would not call them employees, not servants. Even the word rentals, even to recognize that it's renting people will contest that, even though economists are perfectly willing to admit that. They'll say we're renting their labor. No, you're not renting the labor, you're buying the labor. Rent a car, you don't buy the car, you buy the services of the car and the labor of the services that so you rent the person means to buy the services. You rent an apartment, it means you buy an apartment a month or an apartment a year. And so there's all sorts of distortions there. And then people say, well, we rent cars, well, we hire people. We don't rent people, we hire people. Well, if you go to England, they're called hire cars. So in English usage, the hire goes for both. And probably they say, well, okay, we hire cars, but we employ people. People always try to put in a different word to obscure that relationship. But an awful lot of intellectual history can just be traced by the way words evolved. And the system will always want to substitute some positive sounding euphemism, like hire is a nice euphemism in American English, or employ, like in Germany, the employer is a job giver and the employee is a job taker. But you've got to just boil it down, get away from all the euphemisms and say, you're renting people. You used to own workers, now you rent them. And it used to be involuntary, now it's voluntary. So it is different from slavery. I don't use the phrase wage slavery, that's just rhetorical, because it's so different. It's voluntary and it's only rental.
Right. And in fact, we do on the show, we watch these words very carefully. Employee meaning one who is used, has always been disturbing. And when we were talking to the Cambridge classicist about the norms of Roman slavery, I asked him what word was used most common for slaves. And he said instrumentum, which meant tool.
Aristotle's famous phrase was talking instrument, a talking tool.
Talking instrument for a slave. And they would often say that slaves were not men until they committed a crime, like you said. And then they absolutely were treated as liable. Well, I have some very big general questions next, which is one of the things you do in your work is you say, here's how economics got it wrong. And then you'll say, here's how Marx got it wrong. And then you'll say, here's how the law got it wrong. And so what's interesting to me is that I'm interested in the failures of intellectual history that could overlook so much. And if there's a pattern, some of it's motivated thinking, which is, I'm going to think this way because, hey, I own some capital and I want to control the capital. Is there a pattern? Economics in particular has made a ton of mistakes. There's an incredible book called The Origin of Wealth. No, The Origin of, I think it is The Origin of Wealth, although that sounds like Smith. Anyway, it's basically saying that modern economics was based upon physics of the closed systems, and it's clearly not a closed system. And it's the most thorough bombing run on a discipline I have ever read. It absolutely demolishes economics, modern economics, for trying to presume equilibrium. But my question is, how do we get so much stuff wrong?
I don't think it's hard to explain at all. In any system, the people that are, want to be part of the system, don't want to get tarred and feathered and ridden out of town on a rail, are not going to become neo-abolitionist or whatever you want to call it. The whole idea of a social science of economics, or for that matter of law or a lot of other social sciences, is to think that that's analogous to biology or chemistry or physics or math is absurd. Because, it wasn't absurd in old China. In old China, ancient China, your physics had to have a role for the emperor, who was intermediary between heaven and earth. So if you wanted to fit in and not get your head chopped off, you better have physics that says that. And that was one of the reasons why so much modern science developed in the West, because the West was split into different political regimes that competed, whereas in China you had this huge hegemony and everything had to fit that mold. Well, in capitalist society, you've got one mold, basically, and everybody says, well, the alternative is state communism. The alternative is Stalinism or something. So I don't find it surprising at all that whenever economists have a choice on controversial questions, they will, quote, get it right, unquote, not ruin their career. They don't want to become a pariah and so forth. And that's not surprising. What is surprising is some people have got it right. I mean, one interesting example is an Austrian economist, Friedrich von Wieser, who was trained in the law, but worked, economics wasn't so much a separate profession then, worked in economics. And he said very clearly, if you mean imputation, this is assignment of responsibility, in the legal or moral sense, nothing can be named except labor. The capital and land are dead tools in the hands of man, quote. So what was his conclusion then? To make himself a pariah and attack the system? No, he said, well, clearly we don't need that notion. We need a new notion of responsibility, which I'll call economic responsibility. And then he developed the theory of marginal productivity, which has no difference between persons and things. Persons and things both have a marginal product, and that. So he deliberately understood, the whole labor theory of property, the whole difference between persons and things, and deliberately set it aside. He said, yeah, if you mean legal or moral, but we're doing economics here. We're not doing legal or moral analysis. We're doing economics, and economics has to have its own notion of responsibility, separate notion, and that's what's called marginal productivity. And so if you take a microeconomics course, you'll hear a lot about that and how in competitive equilibrium, the wages are paid according to marginal productivity of capital, of land, everything. And so all the factors of production are treated by the same rule. whether they're persons or things. So obviously, you have a system treating persons like things, and yet it's considered to be a scientific advance and promoted in every textbook in the world. I mean, so my other recent book was called Putting Jurisprudence Back into Economics. So simple idea, but how the hell are you going to have a social science, a human science that doesn't recognize the difference between persons and things in the production process at work?
To some extent, it's the same, besides, again, like motivated thinking, what you're talking about, which is I don't want to ruin my career, but it's also taking analogies from physics and trying to quantize economic theory.
The book by my old friend Philip Borowski called More Heat Than Light was exactly that theme. I think other books have hammered on the same theme, but Phil was one of the first ones. Phil Borowski, he's at Notre Dame now. He was a colleague of mine at Tufts University for a while.
So speaking of being tarred and feathered, how's, I'm going to say, the paradigm shifting business for you? Which is, I know I'm using the word paradigm loosely when I say that, but you are arguing for a fundamental paradigm shift, I would argue. And how has the reaction been? What is the nature of the pushback?
Well, in my brief career, was it 20 years or so as an economist, I taught in 4 different economics departments. It wasn't that I didn't get tenure. I was never even put up for tenure. And the reason during those days, this was in the 70s and 80s, you had to be a Marxist or you had to be a neoclassical. And the neoclassicals said, well, people are Marxist or radicals because they can't do the math. So to have somebody around who wasn't neoclassical but had a PhD in math was not a person you want to have around, not a good role model. And the Marxists said, to be a radical, you of course have to be a Marxist. So to have a radical around who wasn't a Marxist is not somebody you want to have around. So those departments, UMass, for example, Boston and other places were split between Marxists and neoclassicals, and they both didn't want me around. So I was never even put up for tenure.
Yeah. I've seen that in literature departments. People are forming gangs. And so you recruit people into your gang, whether it's Marxist analysis of literature or feminist analysis of literature. And those two don't mix, actually. And so you sort of have to decide who you're going to hitch your trailer to.
I originally wanted to be an academic, but by the 1989, I'd run through all these departments. And the only time I even got close to getting tenure was I decided, well, I had to go back into the field of my PhD, which was mathematics and or computer science. And so I was at the computer science department at Boston College, and they did put me up for tenure, but it was rejected because I was too interdisciplinary, that they wanted 100% computer scientist. Here I was doing all this work in economics and intellectual history and God knows what. And, I taught in like 4 different departments, even while I was in computer science, accounting and operations research. I taught the math for economists course over the economics department all the time I was in computer science. So the deans loved it. The dean says, oh, finally, we have somebody who's interdisciplinary. But the people making the decision were not the deans, but the people on the tenure committee. And they said, if you have a slot for an interdisciplinary person, then fine, he's your guy. But we only have a slot for computer scientists, and he's not 100% computer scientist. And so even that was denied. And that was the time in which the whole thing was breaking open in Eastern Europe. So that's when I gave up on academia and moved to Yugoslavia to try to work on the privatization law in Slovenia, which is the most advanced country out in republic in Yugoslavia, so that when privatization came, people would not only get the ownership of their apartment, but the ownership shares in their firm. And people did end up getting ownership shares in their apartments, but not in their firms. And our draft law was defeated by Jeff Sachs, who was totally against worker ownership, and the World Bank. So I had a company then, and consulting company, and I got an offer. World Bank is a big place, and there are a lot of back doors. And I got an offer through one of the back doors to work in the World Bank, and as it were, fight it from the inside. So turned out to be a good decision. So I fought the shock therapy and all that for 10 years inside the World Bank. And there are a lot of people who were against it, but they would never say it in public. But I was, if I lost my job there, I wouldn't be sent back to Africa or India. So I had nothing to lose. And I was in my 50s then, so I had became the sort of the representative critique of shock therapy in the bank. And then Joe Stiglitz came. So the last 3 years of my time there was being his speechwriter and senior advisor. And he agreed with my point of view. So those were sort of the golden years. And then he retired, or he was kicked out, essentially. But he renewed my contract. And so I had a few more years until I had mandatory retirement at 62, and wrote the book called Helping People Help Themselves on the World Bank, which argued that it was impossible for it to do a good job in development. It should basically be wound down. And then I retired, and ever since then, I've just been doing research, writing books.
I've been arguing for a different model, and the different model is, I'm going to take a leap into business models for a second. The different model is that employees are not things, and because they are not things, we should not treat them as inputs to production like anything else. So what should we treat them like? We should treat them like customers who are consuming a product, which is work, and the whole experience of work. And one of the critiques I've always had of unions is that they negotiate for things in labor contracts that are only the kinds of things that you can write down in a contract, and that there's a whole world of things that are very hard to write down. And so the argument becomes very shallow about what people are arguing for, and it becomes oppositional, which is that the only way to win is by one side getting more power than the other. And we on the show, means my listeners and me and some other people, have been trying to reconfigure this and say, look, actually what people want from work is more than the simple things of pay and other things. They want an overall great experience of the work itself. If work was a product that you were buying, what would you want from it? And so it does reconfigure something about the structure of the business model. And one of the things it reconfigures is that now the business is a platform. So what does somebody own? They own the platform, which is mediating a relationship between the buyer of products and the producers
Let me
of.
comment on that. Work and consumption are two different human activities. The employment contract, as historically developed, applies to work, where you're producing value. Consumption is typically where you're consuming value. And we don't have the employment relationship for consumption. See, we buy the inputs, we do the consuming, and we own the outputs, the garbage or the used product or whatever it is. You could organize consumption, value-reducing activities as an employment contract by saying, I'm going to pay you to employ me to eat a hamburger. So I'm not going to buy the hamburger. I'm going to pay you to employ me to eat a hamburger. So you buy the hamburger, you own whatever's left. And so you could apply the whole idea in order to be exactly the same critique. You're treating, once again, a human activity as a commodity, even though you're paying the person to treat you that way in this case. And even though it's a value-reducing activity rather than a value-creating activity, but the same critique that people should be in charge of their own activities, whatever you call it, work, consumption, or whatever. And that's part of personhood and human freedom, self-determination.
One of the reframes that I've been working on is that work, the experience of work, is a product that employees actually buy, and they buy it with their labor. And so the reframe that I'm working on is I'm saying that when I go to work, that yes, I get paid, but I also get the experience of solving puzzles, or I get the experience of getting on stage and talking to people. I get the experience of having status because of who I work for. And that whole thing taken together, not just the pay, including the pay and the benefits, but also including the whole experience of work. Work's fun if it's configured right. And so that there's actually value to that, and it can be considered a product that people buy with their labor. And so instead of following the dollars and the ownership, follow the value, and that then companies who recognize employees as customers would invest a lot more into the whole experience of work. But it's still in a rental model. It's in something like a rental model.
Yeah. I mean, obviously that happens in the employment relationship. that employers want to create a workplace that will attract good people. We're no longer, it's a voluntary relationship. So you have to pay attention to how the employees like it, what satisfaction they give. I mean, there's whole theories of management. One of my favorite was Douglas McGregor and his theory X and theory Y. And theory X was you're paying the worker to do it, but theory Y was the important thing was the intrinsic motivation of the worker. So you have to find the what really turns on or intrinsically motivates the employees and try to organize their work along those lines. Then they will put in their best efforts and so forth, because it's not just a payment relation. They are getting paid, but it is a theory Y sort of thing that it's something they want to do. I mean, school teachers are paid, but they usually do that because they love it, the job. And I think doctors, a lot of professionals are in the same category.
What I can see is, though, that that's independent of the two systems that you've described, which is that certainly a cooperative can have exactly the same belief that it's really important to give people work that they love. So basically, these are orthogonal to each other.
Yeah. Cooperatives have to attract people too, members. And it's the same in any democracy. You want to attract people to your city that are, qualified and do this and that. And that's a pretty general consideration, I think, and not unique to the human rental situation.
Okay, so there's a few questions I ask at the end of the show of every guest. In the case of asking you these questions, it's going to be trickier because here's what I normally ask. Because I consider work a product that people buy, which can be true in either model, the rental or the employee ownership experience. I do design research on what people want from that product. And so I asked the question that was framed or at least popularized by Clayton Christensen at Harvard, which is, if you really want to know what people want from a product, ask them what job they hire it to do for them. And so I ask people, what job do you hire your job to do for you? And so my question for you is, what do you want from your work? What is it that work itself gives you, doing work gives you, that you pursue?
I'm basically an intellectual. So I did teach 20 years or so and developed a lot of ideas and stuff. Work for the World Bank was my only real alienating, shall we say, job experience. Teaching had its bad aspects, but it was basically enjoyable. And then I retired. And so for ever since 2003, I've been so-called independent researcher. I started Institute when I moved back to Slovenia, and we're doing democratic ESOPs. And so that's very enjoyable to have young people doing all this. I'm just the president, sort of a figurehead. But intellectually, it was my input to, got things going. But I'm now working in, as I did always, in many different fields. And I have 6 books in the last 4 years. One book was basically essays from the World Bank. One book was on neo-abolitionism. One book was putting jurisprudence back in economics. And then there was a book on new foundations for information theory, which is, Claude Shannon information theory and all that, making the real foundations for that theory in a new form of logic. And that book in logic is the 5th book. And that's in theory been published, but I haven't got a copy yet. It's very recent. And my 6th book in the last 4 years is on quantum mechanics. And that's accepted, coming out with Springer Nature. It is in production somewhere in India or China or somewhere, where they produce books these days. And so that's what I love to do.
Would you say it's the discovery of truth and the articulation of truth? Is that
absolutely
fundamental?
Yes. New ideas. You've got the whole past history of philosophy and mathematics and physics and all that, and to be able to get into that make headway and bring a new perspective to it that may turn out to be the key to reformulating it. Like in quantum mechanics, it's been an open question for centuries. What the hell is it all about? And I have a theory.
I can't wait to read that. Can't wait to read that.
There have been a number of articles where it's also come out, but it put it all together in a book.
What does your work cost you?
Odd question. It's what I want to do. And if I can get paid for it, fine. I have a pension from Social Security. I have a pension from my years of teaching. I have a pension from the World Bank. So I don't have to get paid to do this work. And, I would want to do it. There's no other, nothing else that I would rather do. Today I spent working on part of general relativity theory. Nobody tells me to do that. So it's my freedom, my choice. And I hope to get something out of it.
I will tell you, wage laborers rarely say that. They almost always say it has costs. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
Best place is probably my website, Ellerman.org. That has all the papers that I can put up there, books. A lot of books are still, of course, under copyright. But if you live in Europe, most books are now available on hacker sites. I had to leave my lifetime of library back in California because I couldn't ship it here. To move to Slovenia, I would have had to rent a whole container or something. But I get everything off the web. So you have things like Anna's Archives, is probably the best one now, that conglomerates all the different sites. And it's great. I can read a paper and it's got books in the bibliography. It's got journal articles, and I can have them at my fingertip in 10 seconds. Even in the old days, you had to go to a library and look it up. And all my books, even the ones that are still copyright, I can't put on my website, but you can actually get them for free. They're all on the web, Anna's Archives or other places.
Which is good because they're super expensive when, as books go. If you're going to buy them, let me just tell you, brace yourself, people, if they're expensive.
I don't know how publishers make money anymore. I think it's libraries that want to get a physical copy.
I'm excited about Anna's Archives. I'm going to track that down. And so it's Ellerman, which is with 2 L's, ELLERMAN.org.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's late on the coast of Croatia, and it must be 10:30 almost. Thanks for staying up.
No problem. Been a pleasure. Thanks for getting in touch.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.